2:30 to 40-ish, and we're scheduled to be together until 5. But I just want to check back in with you as we come back together. I talked at you all morning. In a minute, I'll play a video for you that'll be fun, I think, especially if you're a family finder, because it's somebody practicing family finding in a really fun place called Tasmania. So you can see what that looks like. And but before we do, I'd love to check in. I know I got to talk to, is it Kim? Yeah, so it was really fun to talk to Kim for a couple of minutes, but I just want to check in. Carrie, what are you thinking about after what I shared this morning? What comes to your mind?
I'm thinking about I didn't realize the history of social work practice.
You didn't get a sword with your credentials?
I did one of those when I got my BSW.
Yeah.
But I think I did get trained in that way.
Yeah. Do you think you had some parents that thought maybe you had a sword somewhere?
Yes.
Yeah.
And magic wand.
Yeah.
Fairy dust or something. I also have only ever thought of the history since like the kind of the beginnings, like the early 1900s, and those ninjas and actually what was going on at that time. So I didn't really make that connection with the work.
Yeah.
And so I don't really know exactly where my brain's going with it.
Yeah.
But it was like a big aha moment. I was like, it just, and the scary thing is I see, not just in child welfare, but I see a lot of that repetitive history in our country.
Well, clearly it wasn't just child welfare. Remember, it was overall a view of welfare, from economic assistance to food stamps to justice systems. I mean, it pervasively, right? Yeah.
And then the scary part for the world that we work in and the kids that we care about, families who care about how it's still driving, the work here in Missouri, case management, doing case management as usual, kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, let me, in fairness, say that where I might, without having this conversation with you, have inadvertently left people feeling was that we could simply change this by changing our practice alone. And that wouldn't be fair. I think the truth is that it is a deep structural problem. And without strategies to directly address those structural problems, it may not change very much. And so I think any reasonable strategy for an organization has to also be a political strategy, a communication strategy, and a justice strategy. There's a reason why I got involved in suing the president, not because I particularly had a problem with him. That's a non-political statement. But I'm really interested in structural change. You can really learn a lot from the civil rights movement about the enduring power of structural change. And we are not where we need to be at all in this country, but we're in a different place than we once were in my lifetime because of the hard work of the civil rights movement to bring enduring structural change like the Voting Rights Act and other things. So I don't think we can expect to do any less than that in what we're doing. So I'm interested in that. I've been to the White House 4 times with different bills being signed by presidents of different memberships, if you will. We're working on a strategy for, I'm trying to get cert on a U.S. Supreme Court case involving a black man, a father in Michigan for this next session. We're doing a lot of things on a state-created danger claim about how the government treated him as a father and his kids. Structural change is driven in different ways, and no one strategy gets there. So I work on varieties of strategies, trying to get something to stick. And I think you have to do the same thing in the state. Yeah. Was there, I did want to say, let's talk a little bit more, Carrie, since it left you just kind of thinking about there. Let me just give you, there's a wonderful book worth reading if you like to think about changing systems. And it's called Radical Help. And it came out in 2018. The author is Hillary, Hillary Cottam, Cottam. Hillary is English. What she and I have in common is an international aid background. She worked in several places in the world. I did research on international aid as part of my work, primarily in Rwanda and a few other places, and We both come at this from what we call a capabilities approach, which is a guy by the name of Sen, who won the 1980, he's an economist, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for something called the capabilities model. And both of us are training that way. And so, for example, when I approach a family, I don't look through the lens of what's wrong with these people. What I'm really interested in is, what are you really, really good at? What do you have a lot of? It's what we call a capabilities approach. And so we build networks with that same idea, because if mom's really good at these things and she has a lot of these things, she still might need other things. Let's get the rest of the network together. Let's pay attention to kind of mapping what everybody's got. And then we start, here's the thinking in that kind of work is, the way we've taught casework as usual is you'll recognize this language. We look at families and we want to know what, fill in the blank, what the family's blank is. What's the word that I would put there? It starts with an N. Needs are. And what do we give people who have needs? It starts with an S. Right. So here's the problem from $2 trillion of research in international aid work. When you approach families through the lens of what they need, let me define what need is: what you don't have. And you fill what they don't have with services, very quickly people are turned into objects, right? And when they don't get better, we say they have even more needs, which require even more services, and there is no end to it. And that's what we see with $2 trillion of investment on the African continent. In fact, famously, the book that was written by an economist from there was called Dead Aid, because what happened with the $2 trillion investment is they sowed death everywhere they went. And what people there's a wonderful ebook that I can get you if you'd like to read about this stuff. It's a distilling of interviews with nearly 7,000 people in the world who were on the receiving end of aid. And it's a whole story of how dehumanizing and harmful those kinds of well-intentioned investments were in a needs design, in a services design. So my approach, just to understand that comes out of the research, is what we call a capabilities approach. That's what we look to unlock in people and see in people. I like to say the neighbors can do the judging for free. And the relatives are happy to do it too. The last thing I need is social workers to be judges. I need social workers to be healers. And so we have to teach people the skill of healing, not the skill of judging. But what we've done is create an industry of judgment. And then we've looked at people through the lens of what they do not have. And then we deliver services, and our innovation from 1997 put a time frame on them. Right? And then take their kids and give them the people we like better. Right? It's not working. If it were working, I'd shut up. But let's show you what can work. Just for fun, we're going to show you a film. This is from my colleagues in New South Wales, which is the state in Australia where Sydney is located. And the state agency there is called Family and Children's Services, or FACS. And this, just to set the context for the video you're going to see, I hope he can cue it up, is a worker who worked for FACS who came to a boot camp that I did there. So I do these events when people aren't afraid of getting sick from each other, where it'll be 3, 4, I once did one with almost 700 people for 4 days, and we put everybody in teams of 4 or 5, and they pick a young person or family they're really worried for, and then you have to do what I effing say for 4 or 5 days. And we don't just talk about it, you have to freaking leave, and you need to do that thing you told me you were going to do, and then you need to come back and stand in front of everybody and tell them what you did and how it landed on people. And if I got it wrong, I'll look stupid and I'm happy. This lady was at one of those events working on this case, and we were at the Olympic Park. Remember they had the Olympics in Sydney? If you ever wondered what happens to those places after they spend millions of dollars to build them, they just fall apart because nobody can afford them. So it's a great, cheap place for social service agencies to do conferences at. So if you could picture the place, we're at the Sydney Olympic Village, and this big hotel with hundreds of practitioners from around the state there. And this poor young woman had the misfortune of having to deal with me for 4 days. And she happened to pick this little girl that you're going to meet on that day to work with over those 4 days. And this is the story of what happens where it takes Emma as the caseworker and where the work she does with Emma takes her in the world and what ends up happening. And what I want you to understand is it'll sound very familiar to the people who have done family finding, or even if you've done, I think the local grown version is the 30 Days to Family thing. It'll have some real similarities to that, but I do want to, after it's over, illustrate some differences. What's different about what happened there than maybe we've seen before. Does that make sense? So maybe we can play this. It'll take about 10 minutes.
I was really worried about Jada and Seth. Their parents loved them dearly, but couldn't keep them safe. I worked hard to keep them home with their parents over a long time, and in the end they needed to come into care. But Mum and Dad told me there was no family. Kids need a sense of identity and belonging that can only come from the people that love them the most, and usually that's their family. So I was at a family finding boot camp where it was passionately argued that reaching out to family is the most urgent thing we should do. I knew their mum had grown up on a remote Tasmanian island, so I got out the white pages and I looked up their last name. There was just the one. I took the chance and called. It turned out to be their grandfather, Mort. He hadn't known how to reach the grandkids and he'd been really worried.
To get that call, I wasn't surprised. I wanted to know what was going on.
I was gently painting him a picture of what life had been like for Jada and Seth at the moment when he said to me, "Are you telling me the little ones are in trouble?" I could hear the grief in his voice.
As I said to Emma that morning, I can be up there in 2 days. And that's what I was after. And I wouldn't have been leaving until I brought her back. I wanted to look after her, to be part of her life. It's special. I didn't want to see Jada to be with somebody else. I have been through that. Because I'm one of the stolen generations. I'd have walked to earth to get her back in safe.
Finding Seth and Jada's grandparents was a great start, but I wanted to find more family for them. So I kept searching and I found more relatives. The most important of those was Jada's aunt. Mort and Sue needed support too, and the more family that can be a part of the children's lives, the stronger they'll be. It sounds so obvious now, tracking down family, but we haven't always worked that way. When you take a child into care, everything happens so fast, and sometimes we get focused on just finding a placement then and there for the child. Family finding isn't just about finding a place for a child to live, it's about finding connections for them for life. Both Jada and Seth need healing that can only come from family and people that love them the most. I think about how much more grief Jada might have felt if we hadn't made those calls to family. The very moment Jada came into care, she literally ran into the arms of her family and said, "Are you taking me back to my island?"
What I love about this beautiful island is that my family and my family's family and just generations beyond myself have lived here and grown here and learning new stories and being able to learn and tell my children when I have children, and just to keep that generation and our family alive and our culture. They say home is where you are, and that is true. Home is where I am now, where my feet are solid on the ground and my hair is in the wind. Really nice to be back home.
Jada's brother Seth has medical needs, which means he can't live on the island. So an important part of his care plan is making sure he spends as much time as possible with his family, including Jada, Sue and Mort and his parents. Jada is a beautiful protective sister to Seth, and she cared for him a lot when they were little. Their special connection is crucial to their happiness and one we're committed to maintaining.
Me and my brother's relationship is pretty funny. We're like any other brother and sister. We fight, we kiss, we hug, we push buttons. It's just something about a brother-sister bond that you can't break at all. And he has a disability, but he's still a person. I felt that I was the only one that recognised it, and my parents, of course, but I'm a very overprotective sister of my brother.
When the family flies up from the island, we let them decide what family time looks like. Jada and Seth spent the weekend together doing a whole range of different fun activities and hanging out together. There are no time limits. We just let them have as much family time as they want.
The next thing on target, and Jada knows, he'll come over and spend a bit of time with us. I'd love to see the two of them down here on the beach playing.
We supported Jada to settle on the island, and she's had some professional help around some of the trauma she's experienced. But Jada needed the sort of healing that can only come from family.
They love me, I love them, and I'm grateful that they're here and supporting me, and they understanding what I'm going through and just things like that.
And I started saying to Jada, look, I can see what my dad's seen, what my grandfather's seen, what my great-grandfather's seen. We are looking through their eyes. She went, you're right, Pop. It hasn't changed a bit, has it? I said, no. We got the handed back 2005. My dad fought for it for 25 years. When he passed, and then I took on the fight for another 25. 50 years on, home sweet home. No more arguments. The fighting is finished.
Even though Jada is living in another state, we've continued to support her so she didn't have to deal with another change in her life. Jada trusted me, and I wanted to keep that relationship strong. Visiting Jada has been an adventure because it is so remote, but I didn't want that to be a barrier to staying connected to Jada and showing her that I really care about her.
This is not only her home, the old island is. Everywhere I can take her on that island, I can tell her a story about that bay, how it's got its name, what sort of fish are out there. Remember when we sailed in by the boats? So that is what you're looking at when a child like Jada, who's come back home, is what they look at.
Jada is back on country, and culture is an everyday part of life for her now. She's part of a Junior Rangers program which connects kids with their land and totem, plants and animals. Mort told me that it's good to see we're now bringing their children home.
Being home on the island with family and friends has really helped me. It's helped me remember that I'm not nobody. I'm not just another kid in the welfare system who's had a crappy life. I am somebody, and I have family members and friends who do love me for me, and my brother. It's just helped me recognise myself way much more and grow as a person. Out here it's just fresh and like good vibes only, no negative vibes. You can only it's like a hug. When you get a hug, you get their energy as well. That's what it feels like, a big hug.
My time with this family is coming to an end, but I'll never forget the lessons they've taught me. You need to trust in family. They are the best way to create safety and happiness for children. Love and belonging helps guide the way.
I think a lot of the parents, they teach their children when they're in crisis, don't trust the welfare. And I've said to Jada that sometimes you need to trust them. It's yes. So even when I talk about Emma, it's all good stuff. And Jada can see that now.
Emma, she never put her voice in front of mine. Like, she always let me speak first. This is my life she's dealing with. My brother's life and my mother and father's life, she's playing in their world, so she let that be. She knew that she was in a different territory, and like, she let us go. And then when it was her turn to speak, she would speak, which I thought was really nice, and she had that respect for us. She really supported me through this whole moment. She'd always ask, like, are you all right? Are you okay with this? Yes, no, do you feel this way or that way? She wasn't my caseworker. She was a good person that was there for me and supporting me, and just there for all the right reasons. And I'm grateful that I have a caseworker like Emma, so I have great respect for people like her.
It's been a good experience with Emma and her department. We've been very impressed with the way that they've managed us and Jada. She has all the makings of an Aboriginal activist. I see that in her future. We're very sad that we can't manage Sethy. It's our hope that he'll learn good living skills and maybe be able to come and live here later on when he's older, as a safe place for him, and he can learn culture and about being among his own people too.
There are kids who don't want to leave like me. I didn't want to leave. But now that I realise that it's for the good of yourself, the child, and possibly your parents. If you have siblings and stuff like that, yeah, it's good for them as well, because you can't live in an environment where you're not safe. You don't feel safe. You're not being a kid. You have to fend for yourself. Like me, I had to fend for myself and I had to be an adult for my whole childhood, and now that I'm here I can finally be a child again. I can live my life as a kid and not have to grow up and be adults for my own parents and not have to fend for my brother and stick, which I love doing though. Like, he's got adults out there who are caring for him now. It's important for people to know, because when they know something, they act on something. When they act on something, something changes.
Walking along the beach one day, she said to me, she said, "Pop, how much do you love me? You see all these little grains of sand on this beach? Right from the little ones down to the tiny ones." She said, "That's how much I love you."
It's a fascinating story to put into context of this man. The grandfather said a couple of things there. I'll sort of amplify a bit. One of the things he talked about was that he was a member of the stolen generation, that he was taken as an infant from his indigenous family and he was sold to a white family on the mainland and grew up that way and found his way back to his ancestral home on the island in Tasmania, one of the out islands. He talked about his own father, spent 25 years fighting the government for the land and then died, and then he picked up the fight for 25 years and they had just gotten their land back from the government. So the family, going back generations, had been dismembered by child protection. The child protection system was used to dismember and try to bring to an end the present Australians. So if you imagine then, how all of that history then plays out in this family, why it might be that Emma's mom and dad struggle with addiction and struggle with disability. I don't know if you picked this up, but I know this from working with Emma, that she spent 2 years on her own chasing this mom and dad and Emma and her brother Seth all around Sydney, moving them from one housing situation to another that they would quickly lose. Have you ever had that case? As fast as you can put them in a house, they recreate trauma and drama, and they're out on the street again, and there you are again. She's doing everything she can do because these two kids love their mom and dad a lot, and despite the hard life they've been along the ride with, she's doing all she can to try to keep them together. Ultimately, she's forced to place the kids. Seth has a significant disability, and he goes into a facility for kids with disabilities where he's able to remain fairly stable. But she had parented her brother all of those years, and she was not okay with being separated from him and losing her mom and dad. And so you know what she did. She started just burning placements. And now Emma's chasing her from one placement to another. Finally, she's in a hotel being staffed around the clock when we did the boot camp. She's not going to tolerate being dismembered from her brother and her mom and her dad, and she doesn't have any connection to her Aboriginality or to her land at that time. It was a big boot camp and it was very noisy, and so Emma went out into the facility and found a janitor's closet and sat in there in the dark and just did a white pages search and got the one number with that name in Tasmania for a landline and dialed it, and that grandfather answered the phone and came 2 days later. It takes 2 days to get there from where he's at. And what he said, if you didn't understand what he said, was, "I wasn't going to leave without them." But when you see that family come together, there's a couple of things to pay attention to. You notice in Jada's talking and in Dad's talking, they always acknowledge the mom and the dad. So the approach was that it wasn't about rescuing Jada and Seth from their parents and disappearing them, and focusing on the quote-unquote outcome of having gotten a kinship arrangement for her and getting him off a caseload. That's not the job. The job is to walk with a family that faces generations of traumatic experience and injustice, who have resisted at every step, and honoring that resistance and working with them to find out how to build a good life together, not apart, right? The fact is, Jada said, something about her and her brothers need to stay together, but the truth is, you and I both know that social workers separate brothers and sisters every day. About half the kids in this country who are separated never live together again. It's a very different way to practice, to imagine how do you facilitate that relationship. The other thing that's different is Emma flying for 2 days to go and do visits every so often, rather than handing it off to some courtesy supervisor in the local community. That's not the commitment to family healing. That's getting something off your caseload. So what I want to point to in that story is a different story around the two words that we talk about, which is intentionality and authenticity. Right? The intentionality is an intention to change our practice individually. And authenticity is aligning, what we talk about in practice is aligning our inner state with our outer practice. And so some of you have had exposure, for example, probably most recently to the signs of safety training. How many of you have done that? How did it feel? What's your name? I'm sorry, I can't read your name on the, sorry? Tammy? Tammy. How did that, when you first started that signs of safety learning, how did it feel to you?
I thought it was refreshing just because it was a different approach.
Yeah.
A lot of us have worked for years and years and years, and it's the child welfare system, and it's like the definition of insanity is continue to do the same thing over and over again and get the same results. So it was like, well, it's about time we have a new module, a new model of practice to do. So I found it was kind of like that aha moment. Oh, great, we get to use something else. We can finally move forward from something that we've been using for so many years that continues to generate the same outcomes or
Yeah.
pushed against the wall. Like, yeah, just another meeting that I just came out of and nothing has changed. It's super productive.
So practically speaking, beyond your incredible openness to change, just getting comfortable with the tools, right? Get comfortable with words and pictures. For example, go ahead.
But I think
Yeah.
part of the challenge was getting other people, like
Yeah.
you're going in there,
Yeah.
but you're still facing people that, again, have been practicing the same way, and you're trying to initiate that change and do things differently, then you're getting that pushback. So
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
kind of frustrating.
Sure, yeah. What I wanted to point to, one of the things, actually the woman by the name of Kate Alexander has a cool title. I doubt she makes enough money, but at least they give her a cool title at her state job, and her office is called the Office of the Senior Practitioner. So I think it's kind of a cool title, kind of long, but pretty cool. And she's brilliant and world-class knowledge, and I really admire her. She's the Office of the Senior Practitioner for New South Wales, over all the practice there. And she's been in the job a long time, and she and I were driving out to someplace to do something. I can't remember what we were doing. All I know is there was a lot of kangaroos on the way, and we managed to miss them all. And she was talking to me about at the end there was a circle up there that's a picture of the practice model in New South Wales that I helped her create and roll out in their system. And she was talking about the launch of that, and she said, I've been here a long time, and we've tried a lot of reforms here, she said, and I've been through this. She said, I think this might be my 5th reform or something that I've been through while I've been in my job. And she said, one of the things I recognized, though, she's very wise, and she said, I recognized that, some of the reforms that we did were probably really good, but somehow we couldn't get people to actually do them because they'd been on a job a long time and whatever the reasons were. And so what she came up with was, it wasn't good enough as leaders to hold out a reform you had to really think about how to make that reform real for people. You had to really think about how to get that deeply in the system, and to recognize that some of these reforms would break against the workforce, that they just, I don't know if this ever happened in Missouri, but some people have had the attitude in some of the states that if you just wait long enough, the person who brought the reform will go away, and then you can just keep doing what you're doing. And she certainly saw that. And what she said was she needed to deal with that. And she's the one that landed on the word intentionality and authenticity. And the intentionality conversation she interjected into the system was that we're going to create and be out loud about it. That each of us, from the leader, Mr. Wood, who left, down to whoever, are going to be comfortable with this word intentionality, which is an intentionality to change my practice, an intention to change. And authenticity was this idea that as you try to learn something new, it may begin with you attempting to do that thing, even though you don't necessarily believe that it'll work. And so the definition of authenticity is aligning my internal process with my external practice, right? So when I said right before lunch, I'll say it more directly, Missouri never had a foster care crisis, has never had one. What Missouri has had is a family engagement crisis, and still does. You don't need a foster care system. You might need a few families and communities that are loving and generous and willing to accept their neighbors' kids in for a while their family works on healing. That I would value. But foster care as a replacement for families, you don't need. We have systems now that almost never use it. Of course, getting to people much earlier helps. But that language is hard. You can get your head intellectually around that, but how do I do that with this kid follow me around all week that I don't have a bed for? You know, that's the point about the conversation about authenticity is for a while, I'm going to practice this on the outside, even though on the inside, I'm not so sure. And part of what Kate was talking about is it needs to be safe to talk about that. It needs to be okay to talk about the fact that leaders have made a decision that we're going to do this thing. We are going to do this thing. It may not feel easy or comfortable or even right some days, and it's okay to say so. But the boundary is still set. We're still doing it. Right? In the families, I don't know if you guys have followed the work from the American Bar Association and Annie Casey on moving from a foster care system to a kin-first system. And one of the values in moving to a kin-first system is that leaders hold the line on that change. You know, that nobody in the organization has the authority, nobody but the top leader, to decide not to work with a particular family. Nobody. Not one. And that's how Los Angeles County now is approaching 90% prevention rate of foster care, because the top leader in every office, the buck stops with them. Nobody has the authority to not work with parents in a family except for the top leader, period. And they insert themselves in every case where that's a question, every time. And the result is they've turned their entire system on its head. It requires that kind of commitment to leadership at every level. But that isn't permission to be dumb and to put children in danger, right? And top leaders understand that too, right? Anyway, let me move on. Can we go to, there's a slide that says 3 key principles for healing and development. It's right behind the Missouri Youth and Care number. There we go. So let's just finish up kind of a different way. Remember, I'm going to keep doing this. Standing, you know, for the rest of the time we're together, if we're together, when I'm on this side of the room, it's what we call casework as usual. And when I'm on this side of the room, it's a different way of practicing, right? I'm being very intentional about this way because I want it as a thought exercise. As you approach challenges in learning, I want you to remind yourself that you have the ability to choose where you stand as you confront challenges, right? This is casework as usual. I'll remind you of the language. And exclusionary practices based in government power and a strong family engagement and highly participatory approach, we would say, is a participatory approach based in equity. So there's a difference in the relationship with parents and with grandparents and with young people. Rather than leading with the power of the government's lawsuit, I'm leading with the idea of equity, as in equity like what you want if you own a home is you want to hold as much equity as possible, don't you? You want to own it. So equity means that the family owns it. One of the models we're going to look at in a few minutes is something called the Village Hive model, which is probably the model right now in the world that I have the most, I'm most excited about it. It's developed in Battambang, Cambodia, by my colleagues at the Cambodian Children's Trust, and it's called the Village Hive model. And the co-founder of it, who's not Cambodian, she happens to be Australian. Her name's Tara Winkler, and she taught me something that I've spent a couple years getting my head around about the way they do child protection work in Battambang and now also in Nepal. Listen to this principle and try to imagine, get your head around it. In every instance, the family holds the solution. In every instance, the family holds the solution. Now, the reality in Battambang, when you're doing child protection work, is you don't have a big system standing behind you. If it goes bad, there's nobody to call in and save it. It's you. And so you probably have to learn to be pretty skillful about recognizing that value and how to unlock that value, that in every instance, the family holds the solution. To be clear and not be confused in our context, it doesn't say that in every instance the child should sleep next to a dangerous person. That's a very different value, a dangerous one. It simply said that in every instance the family holds the solution. It doesn't justify dangerous practice. It just tells you how to get to safety. Does that make sense? But let's talk, before we talk about practice models, let's talk about the biology of this. Again, one of my big pieces of research has been around understanding the super system. The first thing is, you're probably familiar when you think about healthcare, because it's been what we've all been exposed to, of looking at human health through the lens of specialties, right? Even the body, we think about things like the digestive system. We talk about the immune system, the nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. We talk about systems. But the truth about the way our body works is it doesn't work independently in systems. It works as one super system. All these systems are talking to each other. There are multiple rhythms within the body that are aligned or they're not. And the first thing we want to awaken to people is that if you've used a caseworker's usual approach, which is based in power, then one of the things that's done to you is it's limited your ability to really work with people to unlock their potential in terms of their growth and their development and their health and their well-being. And I want to just take a minute and talk about 3 principles that you may not be able to read in this slide, that we call 3 key principles for healing and development. And the first one is, what is predictable is preventable. So the understanding, why would it be important to understand adversities that people have experienced? And that is simply that if we understand the adversities, and then we also understand something about the things that may have buffered those adversities that we would call resilience factors, we can form a view that is most likely in terms of how people's development and health trajectories have been affected by their experience, for better or for worse. Does that make sense? So you think about, going back to the film we just watched, if we think about what I said about Jada's parents, mom and dad both have disabilities and both have severe addictions. And in the caseworker's usual world, what language do we use how do we talk about parents who are chronically homeless, have addiction and disability? How do we talk about them in terms of the way we describe them in the record? What would we say about parents typically? Go ahead and say it. Negligent. They're negligent. What other words do we use? Neglectful. What else? Addicted, sure. Anyone ever heard the word crazy before? Right? A lot of drama in their life. Huh? Mental health issues. Think think about a viral video out there called The Danger of a Single Story. When a child welfare person says, mental health issues, they're actually telling a whole story with 3 words, aren't they? A story that justifies removal, separation, and termination of rights often, right? So we view the presence of addiction, the language of mental health as descriptors of problems that either have to be overcome or we have to prove with reasonable efforts that we cannot overcome them, don't we? But when I look at Jada's parents through the lens of adaptation, in the context of a full, thick story of how it begins with the grandparents and the great-grandparents themselves being members of the stolen generation, there's a language for Jada's parents. They were both in care too, by the way. Have you met any parents who are also in care? There's a name for them in Australia. They're called the Forgotten Australians. So they have a name for that generation too. And then there's Jada. So how do I view the presence of addiction and mental illness in the context of that story? I would view it from the standpoint of adaptation. What would you expect to see people suffering with who've gone through generational experiences of injustice and dismembership? And even in their context, you heard them talk about the importance of having their feet on the ground. That's not a metaphoric statement, that's a literal statement. Some of the cases I've worked on in Australia, it was important for kids who lived off country to go twice a year on country to a particular river, take their shoes and socks off, and go down and feel the water and the mud of a particular river in a particular place on their feet, or they would get sick. Does that make sense? It's a literal experience in that context, right? That's from the community's perspective and the family's perspective. So I look at the addiction experience of the parents as an adaptation to an extraordinary long story of maltreatment and dismembership, right? And so if that's the view, how do you heal that? How do we heal addiction in your system right now? How do we heal addiction? What services? Inpatient drug. What's the evidence that actually works, by the way? It looks good on the reasonable efforts resume, doesn't it? But in fact, the evidence shows that that is a death-dealing approach to addiction. For most people, there are some who have made recovery. It may or may not have to have been with that. It may have been something else that brought them to safety and brought them to recovery. But again, it matters. It matters to me where I stand in this. If there's any chance for Jada's parents to find recovery. By the way, what happens to most drug addicts and alcoholics? What happens to them? What? No? Well, ultimately, what happens to them? And the answer is they get to recovery without treatment. But unfortunately for us, they're in their 50s before it happens, and they've missed the opportunity to parent their kids. But I do want to point out that most people with active addictions to substances get to recovery, and they do it without treatment. So in other words, we know that most people actually do recover if they live long enough to do it. They may have many consequences along the way, and I'm not rationalizing a reason to remain addicted. It's extremely dangerous. But my point is, I'm going to stand over here and I'm going to view with the family and the community through a lens of recovery and possibility rather than through a lens of judgment and dismembering people, right? Does that make sense? So out of what was predictable is preventable. If we can predict bad things, we can prevent bad things, right? Including Mr. Wood's worry about safety. If we can predict safety worries, it's the first step to preventing safety worries. If we can predict chronic disease, we can prevent the precursors to chronic disease through our practice. Does that make sense? The second one that we need to remember when I talk about healing, because it sounds so overwhelming, is this one. The brain and the body want to heal. That it isn't really the story we've been told in the American healthcare system about primary health care as the way that people get to health. There are examples where without this kind of health care, people don't survive. There's no doubt about that. But the truth is that much of the healing that happens to people who become sick or have accidents is already embodied within us. We have a capability for healing, for remodeling, and for recovery built into us, don't we? But the problem is, this is where the idea of looking at adversities and what they do, and stress as one adversity, and how it affects people's ability to heal. So you think about a lot of the parents that you've worked with, and the young people that you're working with, and grandparents, kinship givers that you're working with or might work with, is they might be struggling with very particular conditions. But the other thing that's happening is they're under an extraordinary amount of stress. And can somebody get a mom in your mind that you've worked with fairly recently and have a memory for? Janet, I don't know if you're working with parents at this point or not. Or Mary, any parents you can think about?
Yeah, I can think of one.
Okay, how old is it, man or a woman?
Woman,
And how old is she?
probably early 40s.
Okay, and what's her life like? What's she live facing every day?
Well, right now I'm not having kids.
How stressful is that? Anybody mother here? How stressful is it not having your kids and not being able to do a damn thing about it? Except for meet somebody else's ideas of what you should do about it. How does that feel? How much pressure is that? On a scale of 0 to 10, moms, where 0 is the most normal, happy experience of your life, and 10 is you've faced, even childbirth was not as horrifically painful as this. Where is not having your kids in your life and having nothing to say about it fit? Is it 0? What is it?
20.
Is it 20? I want you to think about the fact that this is a living organism who's experiencing, walking around, a 20 out of 10 experience of stress and dismembering from that experience. I'm not justifying what she may have done that led to it, but whatever it was, that's where we're at. We're at a 20. What else has got going on in her life?
Bad partner.
What's that mean?
Well, he sexually abused kids.
How does 0 to 10, how's that for a mom that your partner violated your children?
Probably a 10.
There we go. What?
Stuff because work gets in the way of everything we wanted to do.
So she's got to struggle to keep at work and try to do everything. I just want you to think, what do you think the effect of that is on her immune system? On her blood pressure, right? On her gut flora. What do you think her brain is doing in response to that? You familiar with something called plasticity? What kind of environment of stress is she living in? How much control does she feel over what's happening to her? Which is a whole nother thing. So you see what I'm getting at is the brain and the body want to heal, but what happens when we ignore the larger context of experience and how it bears down on our extraordinary created bodies and what's happening to her health? We actually know that for mothers that have their kids removed for the first year, they have something like an increased rate of death of about 12 times that of a parent who doesn't have her kids removed. Most of those deaths are by accidents, poisoning, and murder, right? Think about the whole person, the impact of this on her. So at the same time, all that's happening, which we don't talk about or acknowledge at all, what we've got is a piece of paper with a list of things you need to do and a schedule and court hearings, don't we? That's what we're tuned into. But are we tuned into what's happening for her whole person, her whole family's experience of that, right? So how do you think she will do with meeting the demands of a service plan when she's coping with the embodied experience of this unrelenting pressure and oppression on her? Does that make sense? We need to start teaching people to tune into what's happening below the neck, right? So what is drug abuse then? What is a drug? Does she use substances by any chance? No. But we've had many parents who did. What do you think substances are going to do for someone like that? By the way, what do you think a partner who beats the shit out of you does for you when you live like that? Right? No, think about it. There could be a function to this. This isn't blaming her for his violence. That's a crime. And it's unacceptable. But why do you think that people that have what we call a stress response system set permanently on high, what do you think a violent partner does for you? What do you think a controlling partner does for you? It helps you feel at your best because you are tuned up all the time, as Bruce Perry would say. You're tuned up. You've got a brain architecture for that. You've got a hormone system that's balanced for that. Not balanced for peace, by the way. When it's calm, you're looking to create a problem because it doesn't feel right to you, does it? Right? We think about the whole person as you encounter people. But here's the problem. If we don't build a network around that parent and work intentionally at those pressures and sharing it, we don't need to make her life perfect for her to get better. We just need to make it manageable. And more hands make lighter work, don't they? So why would we put a network around that mom and with that mom? Because there's a lot to be done and there's a lot of pressures here. And the problem is that her body and brain can't do what it's made to do because it's too busy surviving what we are doing. Does that make sense? The brain and the body want to heal. The point of networks is not to write safety plans. I hate to say that in front of a signs of safety cult, but the safety plans never saved anybody's life or made anybody safe, I hate to tell you. They're a great contract to have so you can finish a lawsuit against somebody. But by themselves, you're not going to heal anybody. But think about safety in your life redefined. Safety is, I can't live being a 20 out of 10 about my kids. And people would actually hear you say that and would have meaning. How do we this is where the signs of safety stuff could be really useful as a scaling tool. How could we get to, what can you live with? I could probably do a 7. It would feel like a walk in the park. Well, how would we get to a 7? I need to see my kids more. Well, caseworker, what's it going to take? Well, you can't be alone with her. You're not sober half the time. They might say that, right? Because it might be true. Why do you think she's not sober half the time? Being around her kids and having walked around at a 20 becomes a 30. And I'd rather be numb and take my chances of getting caught. So what do I need from my network before I can see my kids so I won't have to be numb that day? You know, I can't think my way out of this thing. Maybe I need to walk off some of these stress hormones. I get so worried when I'm going to be around them. I'm afraid I'm going to screw up. And if I screw up one more time, I'm never getting these kids back. Who's going to care about that? All we expect is you better fucking show up. Sorry about that. But you know what I mean? You got a system that's tuned out to any of that stuff, that's just tuned into what it needs to get done because by the way, some parents' experience is to tune out of that pain by letting somebody hit you in the face. Our experience might be to tune ourselves out by becoming numb in other ways to what we're doing. Right? Tune in. It's not just about tuning into what's happening to her, it's about tuning into what's happening to me. I've been saying to people around the world, the question that we should be focused on is not how do we do the work, but who will I be in my work? Can I tune in and recognize what she is experiencing? Can I raise the rooftop if I need to with the people around her that you better come running? She may or may not get her kids back, but if it keeps going the way it's going, you're going to be at her bedside when she has a heart attack in 15 years, which would be 20 years before it should have happened to begin with. Right? I have to find new ways to tell a story to people about what's really happening here. I'm a convener. I'm a facilitator. I am a catalyst, and it is all I can be. I can't fix this, but I can walk with you through it while you and your people fix it, right? But I will fix what? And the first thing I need to pay attention to around parents and kids, I need to pay attention to that surround around them and make sure that the current experience is not so overwhelming the super system that there's no benefit to any therapeutic care at all. It's not that I don't think that therapeutic care can be useful. It's that it matters very little if you're so beyond your capabilities that it will just be a waste of time and money. It might even, in some cases, make it worse. Right? So tune in to the whole person. The brain and the body want to heal. Her body and brain can heal in the right context of experience. I may not be able to change. One of my great influences is Greg Boyle from Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, the largest gang intervention program in the world. And he said, among many other important things, he said, I may not be able to carry what you carry, but we can carry you, right? I can't carry what this parent's got to carry, but can her network carry her? She's been waiting for it her whole life, right? And she's been trying to find it every way she can, including if she had to take a punch in the face, it was worth it. It didn't turn out to work that way. And then she lost her kids. Listen to this last one. This is really important, then we'll get to the practicalities. Our biography is our biology. Our biography is our biology. If you want to look at health trajectories and how they unfold and be predictive, all you really need to look at is the evidence of a life lived. How long can she live being a 20 on a scale of 0 to 10 before she's going to start to get sick, do you think? And by the way, her starting place wasn't 0 to begin with, was it? So what do you think's going on in terms of cardiovascular health? What do you think is going on in terms of immune function? What do you think is going on in terms of digestion, sleep, exercise? Any sense of that she has that she's valued at all by the community? You think about it. You know that becomes a biology. It becomes unfolds as a biology later. Wonderful person that I like to learn from is who you might have heard about is forgotten his first name. Last name's Sapolsky, and he's a neuroscientist and primatologist at USC. And he wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Martha, do you know why zebras don't get ulcers? Because they don't have an anticipatory stress system. So let me play that out for you in the example. If you're a zebra and you're thirsty, and you go down to a watering hole and there happens to be a lion hiding behind the rock who jumps out, you're going to launch yourself and you're going to get away. If you're lucky enough to get away, within about 30 to 40 minutes, your regulatory system's going to go back to baseline and you're just going to go finish getting a drink at the next watering hole. Zebras don't even really think about lions behind rocks when they go to watering holes because they don't have an anticipatory stress system. Humans have an anticipatory stress system. And so think about what it feels like to get stuck in traffic. Anybody get stressed out when you're running late for something? And your body doesn't know the difference between being late for something and having a lion behind the rock jump out when you're drinking out of a pond. Do you see what I mean? So people are giving themselves heart disease by constantly being worked up all the time by their anticipatory stress system because they're not tuning into what's going on in their bodies. Does that make sense? Our biography is our biology, ultimately. The reason the data from the UK kids that I told you about is so bad is it's really simply a metaphor for the lives they lived within their first families and then later in the system. If you didn't want them to die and be sick at 85% rate 30 years later, you would change the way they live their lives, wouldn't you? And that's the thing we need to pay attention to. But I can't change the way they live their lives. Who can? If I can't change the way the kid on my caseload lives their life, who can? Thinking back to Battambang, in every instance, the family. I would add, and I've said to them, it's not as simple as the family. The family and the community can do something about this, right? The family and the community can change the way this kid's living his life. He can change the way he's living his life. I can't change the way he's living his life. But what I know is if we pay attention to how he spends his time, what he's thinking about, what he has to worry about, what he's putting in his mouth, how much he's moving his body, if he's getting the sleep he needs to get, if he feels loved, if he feels a sense of hope that things can get better in the future, I will watch him heal before my eyes over time, right? That's the power of social work, is the power of knowing that. It's not the power of doing things for people, the doer of all things, I like to call you people. Put that on your business card. The failed doers of all things, because you can't possibly do all things. But you can learn how health is built, and you can learn how recovery is made, and you can lead people there. and you can remember the whole body as you work with people. It's what we build networks for. Adaptation is our single greatest gift. Let me give you 2 examples of adaptation that have been talked about. One, Bruce Perry. How many, you guys know who Perry is? So Perry's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, pretty famous. Perry said this, he must be tuned into evolutionary biology, which may not be the quite view we want to take in this building. But from an evolutionary biology position, he would say this, that our greatest single evolutionary gift is to have evolved, I would add, or had created on purpose, a brain that has the incredible capability, more than any other animal on this planet, to connect to other brains and to change our collective futures. Think about what he's talking. I like to, today's, by the way, the 15th, you probably know that. Do you know what the 15th of September is? If you're someone who uses Apple devices, it's the day they come out on stage and announce all the exciting new Apple products you get to waste your money on over the next year. So I'm excited to go back to my hotel room and watch the recorded thing and see what cool new ideas they have. I actually know a couple of them. But what I want to say is these things have changed your life, haven't they? Or your kids' lives. And what you need to know about these things is thousands of people who never even sat in a room together have been collaborating to make these devices and to change your life, haven't they? And if you reflect on your entire lifespan, hasn't it been true that that has happened over and over again, that in different ways your life has been changed and your children's lives have been changed and your parents' lives have been changed as a result of other human beings who may not even sit in a room together, connecting around, making something different that changes the future. Does that sound right? And that's exactly what Perry's position is. But what has the social welfare field done over the last 60 to 100 years? And I would argue that they've taken an entirely different approach, which is make social problems as small as possible by breaking people up. Do you know what the ideal size of a problem is in child welfare and the justice system? 1. 1 prisoner. 1 child in a foster home. 1 parent, not 2 parents, not 3 parents, not 4 parents. Do you see what I mean? What we've done is exactly the reverse of what Perry's talking about in terms of our great evolutionary strength. We make groups of people smaller to make problems smaller for our services. Do you see? Why would we want to build a network? Why would we want that to be as expansive as possible? Because it's aligned with foundational human truths that when we get together and confront problems that affect our collective lives, we're in the best position to invent a solution to it. Does that make sense? So that's adaptation. Here's another adaptation. The reason that we, depending on your viewpoint again, probably if we were to look at it through an evolutionary biology lens, which is one lens, the reason that we're the most dominant species on this planet and burning it down currently is that we have probably of all of the species on the planet, as far as we know, we have the most extraordinary ability to make adaptation to adversity. The kids you work with are the great examples of this. It is tragic that some die. What is stunning is how few do, despite the dangerous things that we know that kids have been exposed to. Do you agree with me? It's actually quite remarkable that as few die as they do. And the reason for this is they have an extraordinary gift of a biology that can make extraordinary adaptation down to the molecular level that favors survival. Particularly survival until you've replaced yourself. Anybody have a sociology class in college? So you got depressed right away when they told you that you were pretty much useless as a man after your first child is born. We don't need you anymore. Check the box. But there's a truth to that. We actually know there's something, how many of you know what a telomere is? Anybody know what a telomere is? A telomere is, or telomere, depending on how you pronounce it, is a protective end cap on the ends of your chromosomes. And of course, every cell in your body has got chromosomes in there, and those chromosomes hold all the genes that you've inherited from your mom and dad. And we know that you can predict how long somebody will live if you do a cheek swab on them and just image their telomere length, because telomere length is predictive of how long you have left on this planet and how healthy you are. Effectively, a natural death is when your telomeres, the caps fall off of your cells, fall off of your chromosomes, and your genes just unwind and you die. And we know that telomere length then is predictive. And we know that what wears telomere length down is what we call the wear and tear effect on the body. The harder your life is, the more adversity you're under, the less buffering experience you have, the less control that you feel over what's happening to you, the more pressure the organism is under. One of the costs of that experience is telomere shortening. Famously, we happen to know that placing kids in an institutional facility, I can show you slides if you're interested. It'll depress you and you'll probably want to hurt yourself. But I can show you slides depending on the age of the kid and how long they're in the institution. We can tell you how much you shorten their telomeres by putting them in that place. There's clear science associated with institutionalizing kids and shortening telomeres. That is an adaptation, because what happens is as you're under that stress what causes the wear and tear is not just the adversity, it's that your body makes an adaptation, and the adaptation is it speeds up time for you. So what we use telomere measures to do is to tell how old you are, not chronologically, but physiologically, because it's a measure of accelerated aging. And so that adaptation is we have this extraordinary ability to endure this incredible stress that mom's going through, and on most days to kind of get through it and kind of hold it together. And she can do that for some number of decades. But it'll come at a cost. It's going to accelerate her aging. How many of you have worked with moms who looked a lot, and dads who seemed a lot older and less healthy than you'd expect them to be? The best example of that is meet the grandparents who also lived that life. And you'll see exactly what's going on for the kid that you're working with. That's an ability to make adaptation. That's an adaptation for survival. And what it leads to, and it's well documented, is it speeds up life. If you look at studies of children who have been who experience abuse and neglect in the home and a lot of oppression, what you'll see is sexual maturing at a much rapid rate. How much have you read about young people in our country right now sexually maturing much earlier? Well, what that ought to tell you something about in the general public is how much stress our kids are increasingly under and what their bodies are showing us about that, right? It's going to speed up maturation because that's how our biology works. We have to speed up our maturation so we can have our kids earlier before we die and can't take care of them. Right? That's the way the organism works. It's also true that people that have really strongly buffered positive experiences mature and age at slower rates because they don't have to make that adaptation. Does that make sense? Our bodies are extraordinarily made for this. We can do all kinds of adaptation to survive this, but there's no free lunch. There's a reason why the kids in that study in England end up dying so much earlier than other people and living so sick. It's because they're paying what what's the co-author of the, not Onda, but Felitti, when Felitti famously said about the ACEs study, he said, there will come a time when a bill must be paid. And what he was talking about was exactly the biology of this, that these kids can make it, they can look pretty good, they can seem fine. Let me give you an example of this just to make you more depressed before November comes and you start celebrating Adoption Month. So finish the story for me about aging out. What is the biggest risk about aging out of foster care without permanency? People become homeless. And so let's talk about that as a narrative that we've used to justify our so-called independent living approach for kids that can't get permanency, and why we have pushed a permanency through adoption agenda in this country, right? But we just saw a year ago, December, University of Chicago completed their 7th report on youth homelessness in America. So we've had an explosion since 2008, 2009 of childhood homelessness in this country, and it's still going up. And so they wanted to understand that, but particularly they wanted to understand that about kids who had spent any time involved with the child welfare system. So the team at Chapin Hall visited 12 states and identified actively homeless teenagers who had care experiences on the streets, and they wanted to research the experience of homelessness from their perspective. Rather than being experts talking about young people, they wanted young people who are homeless to speak for themselves, which I think is really responsible. And here's what they found, that 40% of the actively homeless kids who were formerly in care that they met in those 12 states did not get there from aging out of foster care. They got there after being adopted. They got there after being placed permanently in kinship care. They got there after being restored to a parent. They got there because of permanency. Is that an argument about why we shouldn't have legal parents for kids? It's not. What it tells you is something that they already knew, because Brian Samuels, who runs that office, had formerly been the associate commissioner at the Children's Bureau, the job that Jerry Milner has now. And he had studied this in 2012 when he had been the commissioner at the Bureau, and he already knew that the children who were adopted between 1997 and 2012 did not look much better than the kids who just stayed in foster care. Their educational outcomes were not much better. Their health outcomes were not much better. They simply didn't look like we thought. We thought that remember the 400-year-old theory of change? Move people from bad people to adopted parents, and it would all be made better. But that's not what we saw in the science. And the reason for that is we were ignoring the fact that there was an adaptation. There's a whole super system there that was along for the ride, that's had to make big adjustments to survive all of this. And just because you have a loving legal parent, however you got that parent, doesn't mean that that process didn't happen and that your health trajectory hasn't been substantially altered. Do you see what I'm saying? So my point is, we can't afford to continue to tell the myth that simply getting kids permanency in this system is going to guarantee them a good life, because we have evidence since 2012 that is exactly not happening. We do need to get kids permanent parents, but we and those parents are going to have to really get serious about what happened to their health, what happened to their developmental trajectories, and we're going to have to actively work on it, and we're going to need a healthcare system to partner with us in doing it, because we can't do it. Does that make sense? That's a way of telling the story of adaptation. Next slide, please. I keep forgetting. I'm not in control. I'm used to being in control. It's a good lesson for me. Unless I'm home, then I'm not. Walking together, talking together is creating our future. It really is a beautiful statement from First Nations people in Australia, in this case said by Judy Atkinson, a First Nations woman. Really the vision of our work around this concept of help is that we walk together and we talk together and we co-create our futures with people. We simply don't make these problems go away by using these narrow, punitive, sort of unequal approaches to ignoring the fact that most of the poverty we experience with families we work with is socially constructed and unnecessary. We made a decision as a country to keep groups of people poor. We didn't have to do that. We don't have to do it now. By the way, who are the poor in America? Anybody want to guess who the majority of poor people in this country really are? 2/3 of the poor in America are children. But we've gotten desensitized to what that word means and how it happened. And child welfare exists in a symbiotic relationship with those policy decisions. We didn't create it, nor can we fix it by ourselves. And if we're going to get serious about structural change, we need to have a serious conversation about it. That kind of child safety is as much created by policy and this culture as it is by parents who are really unwell. I'm going to skip this just because of time, and I'm going to pay attention. watching the time. We're getting almost to a break, you guys. Hang in there. So I want to start, but we'll just introduce this, take a break, and then we'll get into the practicalities of this. But I want to talk, if you could go to the slide that says Tools for Relational Practices. I don't know if he's still up. Keep going, there. Tools for Relational Practices. I just like this picture of this notion of social capital. Here's a thing to think about. You probably know that psychiatrists and philosophers and psychologists for 100 years or more have been trying to come to an answer of what is the self, right? Jennifer, what is the self? Yeah, neither did they. So good answer. I like your humility. But actually, a psychiatrist, a really smart person by the name of Dan Siegel that you could find, he's on the internet all over the place. He's among other things, a child and adolescent psychiatrist. He's an expert in healing childhood trauma. He's at UCLA. And Siegel has said that they think they have an answer, finally, after all this time, to what the self is. And the self, he would say, is what he calls a distributed self. That the self is two parts, that it is the me and my personal biology, but it is also the we. And the we is the quality and support of the relationships of the people closest in my life, that the self is distributed. It is not only my own biography, it is also a measure of my interaction with the people closest in my life. Does that make some sense to you? A distributed self. Makes a lot of sense to me, and that's how he and his colleagues see the self. So when we do child protection work, particularly for kids who've been removed, what's happened to the child's self when we've done the removal? Right? They continue to hold a particular biography as an individual experience. That doesn't change. But what we've done is sever the whole context of the distributed self. So what do you think happens to kids? Think about the biology of this, think about the mental health impacts of this, the behavioral impacts of then raising somebody without a complete self. What do you think you're going to end up with? Exactly what we see over and over again. In fact, how many of you have worked again with kids who are the kids of parents who were our kids? I mean, I said to the Texas CASA people, the kids you say you love, you guys have CASA volunteers here in Missouri? So, they're for the child. Have you heard that one before? They got all the answers after their career bagging groceries someplace, and lovingly so. And but they got all the answers, and they'd be happy to write that report about how wrong you are. I don't know if you've had that case yet. And so we've been doing lots of training with 10,000 of them in Texas, and they're amazing partners when you actually know what they're talking about. And we learn together with social workers, right? We learn together. And what I said to the Texas people to challenge them is the kids you say you love, their parents were those kids. It lacks integrity to forget that. You're not for the child if you're not for the parent, because you're telling yourself a lie. Too often, the parents of the kids we work with were once those kids, and if they weren't, they probably should have been. Right? That's our work. Our work is healing the family, not just rescuing kids. But what I want to do is finish this segment and then move in for the rest of the day, just move into an interactive, practice-focused work, and then tomorrow. These are pictures. Oops, can you move the slide? There it is. These pictures I'm borrowing from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. And they reflect something I talked about this morning called, there were three things: allostasis, allostatic load, allostatic overload. The picture on the right, the kid who's blue, he's not cold. Blue in this case means good. This is a kid who's doing really, really well in terms of his health trajectory over time. We could predict that by about age 60 for this person, that he'll be in reasonably good health, barring any accidents or diseases associated with genes that we didn't know about. And And we can predict that. And what you're looking at is that teeter-totter image. And what's different, as you know, about a teeter-totter is the fulcrum, which is placed squarely in the ground and doesn't move. And then we place the teeter-totter board right in the center, and kids play on that. And that's kind of the image here. But in this particular case, what the fulcrum represents are the genes that you inherited from your parents, and a structure above those genes called the epigenome. And what we learned in the Human Genome Project was that our understanding of genomics was incomplete, where we thought that people simply inherited these inheritance, and it was a fixed inheritance, and that you lived with the risks and benefits of that. It turned out through the Human Genome Project, we learned that wasn't the whole story, that there was a structure above the genes that you inherited called the epigenome. And what the epigenome does is tell your genes what to do. It tells them when to turn on, when to turn off, when to turn up, when to turn down, like a light dimmer. And this kid, because he has strong supportive relationships in his life and has over time, so he has responsive relationships connected to him. He's been encouraged through his development, or she, to have an increasing sense of mastery over the world and over their lives. This is very interesting coming from the scientists from all the major research institutions in North America. I don't know if you can read this, but it says that he has membership within his faith and culture. That's interesting. Who would have expected from this particular group of scientists that you would get a consensus viewpoint that it's actually critical to have access and belonging to your faith and culture, to be able to produce this kind of healthy person who can contribute in the world. But that's exactly what they found in the science. And ultimately, that this context supports his strengthening his adaptive skills, developing skills to adapt and negotiate his development and the world around him. That's what we call allostasis. What's happening is not just that he's doing well, but his epigenome and his genes are moving. This is what we call resilience building. You've heard the term resilience, but in this case, we're talking about that at a molecular level rather than a behavioral concept or an experiential concept. It's how the body responds to resilience building by building that resilience. You know, probably many people I've read have inherited some genes that are not optimal for you. You might know what they are and you might not know what they are. But it doesn't guarantee you getting sick. In fact, it's likely that those genes will never be expressed if you have his experience. I'm an identical twin, so I have a brother. And so I'm sensitive to the twin studies here. There's a wonderful video I might show tomorrow that shows these 7-year-old twins and then these 60-year-old twins, and they cheek swab them, and they sequence their DNA, and then they take the two twins and they lay the DNA gels over each other so you can see how much of the genetic material is identical and how much has changed. And you know that identical twins are clones at birth, that my brother and I were from the same egg. We're literally clones. But if you were to sequence, we're 56 years old. If you were to sequence our genes and lay them over the top of each other, you would never know that we were twins. And it's because we've lived very divergent lives in our adulthood, and our epigenomes have responded differently to the lives that we have lived. Even by age 6 or 7, about 30% of the genes of these kids have already diverged. And that'll continue to happen as they live their lives. That's called the epigenome, right? Part of what we're trying to argue for here is to become mindful that everything you do with people is written on the genome. You are going to leave a mark on somebody. It'll be written on the genome. In these, what are called, I don't know if it even matters to you what it's called, but there's a methylation patterns that reflect experience and turn genes on and off, up and down, based on experience. And the work that you do with people, for better or for worse, is going to lead to a record of that work. I heard your director, somebody talk about home visiting. The most famous example of this is the original home visiting kids. They went and saw them as adults and cheek swabbed them and looked at methylation patterns, and they could see the methylation patterns for the home visiting intervention right on their genomes. That not only can you write on people's genes in negative ways, you can write and transcribe in good ways changes that you bring to people's lives. It's that, we are that sensitive. We are that extraordinary as creatures. It's just amazing. The kid on the left is headed for big trouble because what you see is how much the fulcrum has moved for this kid in response to negative experience. In the short term, that is adaptation that is helping that kid weather what is happening. But unfortunately, it's going to, more likely than not, create future vulnerabilities, because what it's going to do epigenetically is it's going to start shutting down or never turning on genes that favor good health, and it's going to start turning on or turning up the function of genes that produce disease. That's what those two pictures mean. There's a whole series of images like that. And one of the things I'm going to send you is a video game from Harvard called the Resilience Game, and it'll take you about 20 minutes, and they're going to put Carrie in charge of a whole city and all the kids in it and all the families in it. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? And then they're going to throw negative situations in the community at you, and you're going to have to make decisions about how you're going to respond in public policy, and it's immediately going to show you what your decision did to those kids' health over their life course. And once you've done that for 20 minutes, you're never going to look at another person without seeing where you think they're at, right? What is predictable is preventable. I need to know quickly where I think somebody's at so that I understand how to power up the intervention to start moving in the direction either to complement what is already happening or to disrupt what is happening. Right? Where we see negative trajectories playing out over time, our job as child protection people is to truly protect. Beyond the immediate response, it is disrupting negative trajectories, right? Also true for parents. We do that by teaching people about how their health works, which we'll talk about. So let's take a break for 15 minutes and then we'll look at some of the practical tools, okay?